because we actually know quite a bit more. The Capcom left a lot of breadcrumbs here, and the confirmed cast so far for Street Fighter 6 is Ryu, Chun-Li, and Luke. So that's the hope there, is that Capcom actually does something worthwhile with the plot. They've talked about it. It was something with Street Fighter 5. Ono came out and said, look, we're not going to have an NRS level of plot in Street Fighter 5, but for the next game, that's our goal. Hopefully, Capcom's able to bring back the fan base that really loves the Street Fighter franchise for what it is, a balance between offense and defense, footsies, with punishing, all that kind of stuff that we hope what Street Fighter really should be, and what Street Fighter 5 kind of missed the mark on in a number of regards.
But I think that segues us pretty well into the stuff that you wanted to talk about.
Heck yeah. So everyone, if you don't mind, leave a like on this video. It helps out the channel a ton. It's a really good way of supporting us. So if you don't mind doing that, it's a great way to get going. But I want to talk to people about what we know now about Street Fighter 6 with this announcement, because we actually know quite a bit more. The Capcom left a lot of breadcrumbs here, and the confirmed cast so far for Street Fighter 6 is Ryu, Chun-Li, and Luke. We've got 3 characters confirmed. Ryu and Chun-Li come in because Capcom has said they're not going to make a Street Fighter game without those 2 characters in there, so they're a lock. You could say, like, maybe does that include Kin and Akuma now? It's like, it depends. Like, you never know if those characters are coming as DLC or part of the base roster, right? But we know that those 3 characters are now confirmed. Luke is going to be a major part of the next Street Fighter project. That is what Capcom said, and we currently know this as Street Fighter 6 is what we call. They might call it, they might go out of nowhere and call it Street Fighter Cross Street Fighter or something like that. Yeah. But anyway, it's likely going to be announced at Capcom Cup 2022, right in the middle of February. So we're just a handful of months away from this, and the plan is for both you and I to be there. So if you see us there, hey, come give us a shout out. Love talking to the fans out there. But expect a March or February or March 2023 release date. That's about a year after it's going to be announced, because this is how Capcom does things, right? They love that Q1 for releasing major fighting games, and I can't blame them, because that has been a very good spot to release their games throughout the years, usually.
Especially if they're going to do the Pro Tour, right? Because the Pro Tour has always kind of fallen in like kind of the March into December and such, and so you have that time, right beforehand. And if you were to, yeah, exactly, it lines up with the Pro Tour as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, actually, they did confirm that there's going to be a Capcom Pro Tour 2022. They already announced the DLC for it, and so that, of course, we're going to have new balance changes come out in March, and so we've got a whole nother year once Street Fighter 6 is announced of Street Fighter 5. So, it's a good time to kind of, again, you don't have to play the game super seriously, but if you are interested in playing Street Fighter 6 from the get-go, it's a little springboard, and that is the actual terminology that they use there. Capcom said that Street Fighter 5 is going to springboard them into Street Fighter 6, or the next Street Fighter project, right? So take it for what it's worth, but again, it's just a kind of a nice way of getting into it, because one of the things that I really felt strongly about is with Street Fighter 3 to Street Fighter 4, the games were so vastly different. But from Street Fighter 4 to Street Fighter 5, I felt the gameplay was much more similar, right? Like it wasn't that big of a departure. The way that Street Fighter 3's neutral played and the whole game played, just night and day different from Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 4. But I personally feel like Street Fighter 4 was very similar to Street Fighter 5 gameplay-wise with some tweaks and stuff. But I'm kind of curious how you feel about that.
Yeah, because you have people that are freaking out right now. In fact, this is a good time to comment and tell you why you disagree with what John just said. So I think that there's room for that. I don't see it immediately, but I'd like to hear the details of where you think things cross over and are similar, because when I think of the transition from 4 to 5, the first place my mind goes is there were a handful of things they wanted to make sure to get rid of in 4, things like option selects and whatnot, and they wanted stuff to be much more commitment based. Now that part of the game was very different, but there might have been some other parts that weren't so different. I think they wanted to get rid of set play, which they didn't really in the first season, but have since gotten rid of it. But what would you say are the main differences between 4 and 5? Or I'm sorry, the main similarities between 4 and 5's gameplay?
I think that once you remove the option selects, I think that the games both tilted pretty heavily towards offense. Option selects were mostly, not always, but a lot of defensive enabling there, especially with crouch techs and different things, and especially with being able to focus absorb and then backdash, and just kind of get out of pressure situations and whatnot. And I think if those things were not in the game, I think Street Fighter 4 would have been a heavy offensive game. And so that's kind of the first spot I go to. And if you compare it to something like Street Fighter 3, parries almost completely negated projectiles. And negating projectiles in a Street Fighter game is a really big deal. And it's, if you think projectiles suck in Street Fighter 5, like you didn't play much Street Fighter 3. Like it's they had to just do crazy stuff to make projectiles even somewhat relevant, and even then they weren't that relevant.
But what about Street Fighter 4? Because you had focus attack that it wasn't as effective as parry because you did take that gray damage, but you could just sit there and absorb them.
Yeah, but the thing about with Street Fighter 4 is you would still take that gray damage, and then after like 2 or 3 fireballs, you started risking a lot with continuing to focus. You generally wanted to get in after that point because the risk reward started to be heavily against you. Where in Street Fighter 3, you could parry all day long, and there was no reason not to. It would build meter, it would do a bunch of stuff for you, so why not sit back and parry and make someone, build up, and plus you could whiff normals in neutral in Street Fighter 3 to build meter as well. So you could literally camp out all day long against someone who's chucking plasma on you. Literally, fireballs have never been worse than they were in Street Fighter 3, in a Street Fighter game.
Sure, and they're bad in 5, relatively speaking, or they have been. It's not been a projectile throwers game. There have been a couple of characters that have been excelled at throwing projectiles, but even then, it's like it's not based around that, and it's usually not good to hear that a new character is based around throwing projectiles. I mean, there are some similarities between 4 and 5, and I don't think we need to get too stuck on this particular point. But I do feel like the just general feel of both games is fairly different. The pacing is fairly different. The balance of offense versus defense, like. I mean, of course, there's a lot of offense in 4, but I think there are a lot more defensive options with backdashes and such. And yes, option selects can take care of that in certain scenarios. But even then, I think you can throw projectiles more effectively. So I do feel like they're pretty different when it comes to. I mean, maybe they're less different than other comparisons in Street Fighter, and that might have been your point there. But I don't think that they're very similar in the way they play.
Yeah, it's I look at stuff like the Alpha games and Street Fighter 2 and all this other kind of stuff, and there's kind of a bloodline that kind of runs through all these games where they've got similarities, but to me, 4 and 5 are much more similar. I just think that 5 is a much better game in terms of, but we've been into that, but a much better game in terms of how many issues they took out of it and how much more continuity and stuff they have. But again, that's something Ono talked about a lot with Street Fighter 4, is going back to the Street Fighter 2 roots to try to make the game play that way, from jumps to pressure to a bunch of other things, having fireballs be relevant again. Fireballs were very relevant in Street Fighter 4. So I do think that Street Fighter 6 is going to be its own thing, but it's going to be an interesting kind of transition. But it's we'll see when it gets here, right? Because we're speculating, but that's how I feel about it. But anyway, I also feel like that there's a good chance that this game is going to be compatible with the PS4 and Xbox One, because it's really hard to get your hands on a PS5 or Series X or Series S at the moment. Although PC is now Capcom's primary platform, which they've confirmed, even then it's hard to get your hands on a strong GPU. And that means that there's a lot of incentive to make your games run well on older hardware right now. So if you enjoyed playing it on these current platforms, which a lot of people do, a lot of people still play on the PS4 and they haven't tried to go to PS5, you might not have to upgrade. You're just going to run into like worse graphics and longer load times. Shouts to input delay. But I think that those are, but I still think that Street Fighter 6 is going to be compatible with these older systems as well, because it's too hard to get your hand on new hardware right now.
Which is nice to hear for the majority of us that are not planning on, or that don't have a next generation console quite yet. And I do agree with you there that it's probably going. I mean, that tends to be the kind of thing, like the old systems, the older systems, they stick around for a while, and a lot of games are made for them, and you can get on either one. And I agree as well. It'll be a year from now, so probably. So it's like, well, we'll have to see what the landscape looks then. But I would probably err on the side, if I were betting on it, that it would still be available for the previous ones. But I don't care because I got it on PC, so whatever. I think also right now John's having some issues with his landscaping crew, and so you might have already heard those in the background. At the same time, when we're talking about landscape, we probably should talk about support for the EventHubs podcast is brought to you by MANSCAPED today, which offers precision engineered tools for your family jewels. MANSCAPED has just launched their 4th generation trimmer, the Lawnmower 4.0. And we have an exclusive offer for you today. If you go to manscaped.com, you will get 20% off and free shipping and handling if you use the checkout code EHubsPod when you check out. 20% off, free free shipping and handling, and it lets them know that we sent you. And that's a really important part of the process.
Yeah. Manscaped was actually kind enough to send us both the Perfect Package 4.0, which includes not only the Lawnmower 4.0, but also the Crop Preserver, which is an anti-chafing ball deodorant, and the Crop Reviver, which is a ball spray toner. Both of these do wonders below the belt, leaving you feeling comfortable and looking confident. We need to look confident, John, and also smell like you care. And you know what, John? I tried this out with a wife last night, and she liked it.
Ooh.
So if you're trying to please the ladies, this worked on my lovely wife.
We know that the FGC doesn't exactly have the best resume, the best track record, the best perception, let's say, when it comes to hygiene. Well, fair enough. Let's start today. We have an opportunity. We can take a high quality product, and I've been using it. I've been using all of these. I deem them high quality. John, are they high quality?
Oh, they're great. They're
absolutely
definitely great.
20% off, free shipping and handling, and we can begin dismantling a stereotype with the Lawnmower 4.0 and its accompanying ball products. One of the things I wanted to point out about the Lawnmower is it has a ceramic blade, which means less snags, less catching, less cuts, stuff like that. And when you're trimming your balls, that's like one of the most important parts about it. It also has a 4000K LED light, so you can see exactly what you're doing no matter how deep and dark you've allowed your pube forest to grow.
That light is amazing. It is so nice to have. I never knew I needed it until I tried this, and now I'm like, I'm never using anything else without that light on there because it's a ball saver. Also, Manscaped's going to take really good care of our audience out there because they can get 20% off.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, hey, it's a good deal. Just use that code EHubsPod at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com. Again, just punch in that code EHubsPod. Unlock your confidence and always use the right tools for the job with Manscaped.
Balls.
They say that Luke is an important character for Street Fighter's future, and that's where things get interesting. Ryu is the main protagonist of the franchise, and really the lead character from like Street Fighter 1 into Alpha into the Street Fighter 2 games. Once you hit Street Fighter 3, though, it becomes him and Alex, and you're seeing more characters share the spotlight and stuff from there. They just put out a video that shows Abel as like the Street Fighter 4 protagonist, which is pretty much garbage because like Abel had no lines and no dialogue and no anything. And then
Who am I? I think I like dogs. Can you identify with me? Like no one can relate to that.
Yes,
like,
yeah. You're a Bison clone, and then like you fight Fei Long because you have to repeat yourself or something like that. It's terrible.
Do you like 50-50s? No? Well, here you go. You're in one anyway. Brainless.
Shout out to Sanford, man. That was a great moment. But anyway, then you get to 5, and actually Rashid does have a good amount of time in the limelight, and he does good things and stuff with the plot and all that kind of stuff. It's like, okay, hey, Rashid, I can see him as being kind of a shared protagonist with Ryu.
Barely, but sure, but barely.
Yeah, and then that's where Luke is going to come in Street Fighter 6, if you ask me. What role he's going to be in the military is maybe, G has some military ties to Byron Taylor or whatever, and shouts to Byron Taylor doing his damn dance, which is the worst thing I've ever seen in a Street Fighter game, I think. And we'll definitely have the graphic come up there to show that. But anyway, Ryu's, of course, going to still be the main guy. Bison's dead. There's room for another character to come in and share this role. But John, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about Capcom doing another shared protagonist kind of role with Luke being the dude?
Yeah, okay, so my initial reaction is who cares? There's not a lot of care initially for it because Street Fighter has never been super strong, or I dare say hasn't drummed up a ton of meaning when it comes to these other characters. And in fact, like we talked about them a few weeks ago about like who won the tournaments and stuff, and people like it wasn't just Ryu. Isn't Ryu always the protagonist? And like some people know that Alex was Third Strike's protagonist, technically speaking, and whatnot and stuff. But like Abel, did you know that Abel was Street Fighter 4's? Do you care? Is it a big deal that you know now? The same thing with Rashid for Street Fighter 5. Now that said, That's because a lot of these stories haven't been executed all that well. They are paying a lot of attention and caring a lot more, as far as I can see, about story now. And so they might be gearing up to do a really rich and in-depth story that people care about on a level that they never have been before. And if that's what they do, then all of a sudden this title of being the co-protagonist is a much bigger deal than it was, or than it has been, traditionally speaking. And for some people it's already a big enough deal because they care about this, and without Capcom needing to put a bunch of bells and whistles and meaning into the story. Fair enough. But I think a lot more people will get sucked up into it and appreciate it, and they should, if Capcom does this kind of well, what I think they might be setting up for with the story here. So yes, give him some significance, and then I can appreciate that. But if they keep doing things the way they do it, I'm more looking at, is he fun to play? Is he a cool character as a character that I'm playing in the game? Those are the more important things. But I do leave some room for where they might be going.
And so that's the hope there, is that Capcom actually does something worthwhile with the plot. They've talked about it. It was something with Street Fighter V. Ono came out and said, look, we're not going to have an NRS level of plot in Street Fighter V, but for the next game, that's our goal. That is what we're trying to actually execute and have something worthwhile. And I can say with Street Fighter V, especially if you go and play the 50 million arcade endings, which no one does, but unless you work on EventHubs, because then you have to do that part. But if you go and you do that, like, you can see that there's actually some foundational stuff they put in the game that makes sense and actually is interesting and cool and advances the plot forward. Some aspects of Street Fighter V actually do take place after Street Fighter 3, which is something people have been asking for. It's like, oh yeah, like some of this stuff actually happens afterwards. They're trying to make some interesting things happen. So as you say, if the execution's good, if a lot of ifs, buts, and if your whole philosophy on this is I'll believe it when I see it, well, you've got a lot of reasons to feel that way. So
Sure.
we're hyped about it because we've talked to the developers. We know that there's an intention there to make this happen, and we'd love to see Street Fighter actually done right for the first time ever in terms
You
of a
know,
plot. So
Yeah, and with this whole transition, because Luke has been so wrapped up into, like, not only the story but the end of SF5, the beginning of SF6 or the next project and such, the feel around this right now, obviously Street Fighter 3 to 4, there was a huge black hole of time where there was a drought, and we all kind of know about that. And then the transition was more like all of a sudden a grand resurrection of the franchise. The transition from Street Fighter 4 into Street Fighter 5 was odd because obviously Street Fighter 5 felt rushed. A lot of us weren't ready to stop playing Street Fighter 4. And then now here we are on the precipice of the transition from Street Fighter 5 into what is probably going to be Street Fighter 6. And while maybe asked me a year or two ago, and a lot of people, it's like, oh, I just can't wait for 5 to end. And that's still somewhat of, like, I think 5 is we're pretty much done with it, but it has gotten to a place where it's fun enough and it's good enough, better than it ever has been, that we'll play it for another year. And I think that's, no one's like super upset about that, but it feels like we have a certain momentum and things are like dialed into a pretty good and balanced degree that I think we're going to be ready to make this transition more smoothly than at least the last two that I was around for were made. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they handle that.
I actually, I'll go on the record here and say I think there's going to be a handful of very passionate and vocal people who love Street Fighter V because it's such a Marvel Street Fighter game. It's so offensive tilted and it's so commitment and all this other kind of stuff. You just don't want to be in certain spots on screen because you're dead. Like, if you're there, you're dead, and that is very not Street Fighter like, right? So there's going to be some very passionate people that I think come out of the woodwork once Street Fighter 6 kind of hits and like try to keep the scene alive with Street Fighter 5. But if it didn't work for 4, I don't think it's going to work for 5. I don't think this game's long-term future is very bright, right? But I think it will be a nice way. It will go out with a nice solid, hey, last year of the game, let's have some fun with it, and hopefully Capcom's able to bring back the fan base that really loves the Street Fighter franchise for what it is, a balance between offense and defense, footsies with punishing, all that kind of stuff that we hope what Street Fighter really should be, and what Street Fighter 5 kind of missed the mark on in a number of regards.
At least at first. And I will say that I like a lot of other people right now have high hopes for where things are going. So it hasn't been a good time to be a Street Fighter fan, but it is now finally a pretty good time to be a Street Fighter fan, an optimistic time, I would say. And there it is.
What could possibly go wrong?
Ain't nothing terrible gonna happen today.